Yes, he is.
All right. And the last, I guess, the last question I have before I open up the super chats here is, you know, all through this period, the people on the receiving end of all of this grievance and vengeance and so on has been the WASPs. Um, when did the WASPs get so, for lack of a better term, cucky? I mean, you said they went from a position of essentially controlling the CIA and the FBI in the 60s to, I mean, fast forward, what, 60 years or so. And I mean, here we are, still basically the whipping boy for all of these different groups. And even, I mean, I would argue even the quote unquote MAGA movement, which a lot of people from WASP background initially sought as a vehicle, possibly for their political aspirations and goals and so on. I see even that now is, I mean, you know, I mean, they've got Marjorie Taylor Greene rapping and shaking her ass, and the hood for Trump and gold sneakers, and I mean, it just, I mean, it doesn't look like a WASP thing to me from the outside looking in. But so yeah, how would you like? When did the WASPs going to lose their political spine?
Well, they really took a beating in the 60s. They really did, with the civil rights revolution, with businesses beginning to hire deliberately minorities, and even many of the whites they hired, they tried to get from quote unquote disadvantaged backgrounds, which is just another way of saying white ethnic. So this really changed things in the 60s. I mean, this really changed things. And a lot of the WASPs took on a sort of self-loathing motif wherein they saw themselves as oppressors of America rather than facilitators for it and the originators of it. And they just sort of blanked out on the national level. They were still around, but they were in just one part of a power sharing coalition, at least among the Democrats. And the GOP was still unambiguously them in control, but they were interested very much in bipartisanship with the Democrats, because at the time, that's what people demanded, particularly after the whole Watergate thing. So it's really something else. But now in certain parts of the country, the WASPs held on, and they still do, particularly rural areas. In my neck of the woods, Central Florida, they ran things unambiguously, lock, stock, and barrel. They were the majority, along with the Scots-Irish. This was in the 90s and into the 2000s. Now, many of them still run things, but they are a distinct minority among the general populace. And interestingly, the area has grown more Republican since then. So it's strange. But the GOP itself, this is getting into what you were saying, has diversified. So when you see a large concentration of Republicans, it does not mean a large concentration of Anglos, as used to be the case. It used to be the GOP was the Episcopal Church at Prayer, which is a part of the Anglican Communion, and now it's a collection of many different people. And that goes back to the 60s, interestingly, when whites began to congregate in its ranks due to the Democratic Party's leftward shift, particularly on racial and social issues, and then eventually on economic issues. So it's really something else. But the WASPs, it wasn't just in one moment that they lost their power. It was a series of events on the national level. They were thoroughly, you could say, humbled by the 70s. And when Reagan took office, he appointed a lot of white ethnics, and even some blacks to key offices, Hispanics too. So at that point, the last real WASP Republican president where you had unambiguous WASP power was Gerald Ford. And that was an extension of the Nixon presidency. So the Republican Party, even by the 80s, was de-WASPifying tremendously. And today, like I said, even in areas such as my own that are very GOP, the WASPs, even if they still seem to run things in politics and in business, they are nowhere near a majority of the population. So it's interesting. It's been a series of events over the span of several years, decades, even if you go down to the regional and local levels. Nationally, it was about a 10-year span. But because by the time Jimmy Carter came around as president he took office in the late 70s, 1977, even though he's a Southern WASP, he appointed an overwhelmingly non-WASP administration. So he between ethnic whites and minorities. And even though Reagan positioned himself as the anti-Carter, he actually followed Carter's lead when it comes to the diversification of appointments. So it's really interesting stuff. It's one of those things wherein the right tends to emulate the left despite getting into office on the basis of undoing what the left did. The Equalities Act in the UK, which was under the Labour government, obviously, was mirrored here in Florida as something that would be very based and right wing because it prohibited any form of discrimination on the basis of race or sex. And the idea was that whites would not be discriminated against, and men would not be discriminated against, and women would not be discriminated against. But it's another piece of anti-discrimination legislation, which is obviously going to be reinterpreted by the judiciary and hijacked for left-wing aims, even though there are already anti-discrimination laws on the books. Interestingly enough, but it's interesting how this stuff goes.
Yeah, I thought that was hilarious. I actually wrote a Substack piece about it at the time. That Ron DeSantis' Stop Woke Act was literally a rewrite of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's signature, 2010 Equality Act, which in itself was an amalgamation of many different decades worth of anti-discrimination laws that had grown up since the 1960s. That they basically took them all and they put them in one act, basically. So yeah, I mean, just before, somebody's mentioning George W. Bush in the chat and his dad as WASP presidents. I suppose I should ask you about this as well. There's this group that seems to be politically significant in America called the Evangelicals. Now, from my point of view, these people just seem completely insane and also obsessed with Israel. In ways that I just find mystifying, and they have always been presented in the media here as people to be made fun of or whatever. But do evangelicals count as being quote unquote WASPs, or are they some new thing? Can you explain, like, who are the evangelicals and why have they become so? They're even part of Trump's coalition today.
Mm-hmm. They are. Yes, they're not nearly as big as George W. Bush's coalition, but they are part of Trump's coalition. They absolutely count as WASPs if they're Anglo-Saxon. Or Scots Irish nowadays, they'd be lumped in with WASPs. So they count. But the evangelicals, since the civil rights revolution of the 60s, they've taken on a very race-inclusive perspective wherein they are morally conservative on some issues, even though this is waning, like, say, gay marriage, abortion, this, that, the other, same-sex adoption. But they're ultra-inclusive when it comes to race and ethnicity, of course. I mean, if they're inclusive when it comes to race, then they must be inclusive when it comes to ethnicity. So they wind up having a form of conservatism that is culturally sort of incoherent because it's not a specific group with a religious value system like, WASPs traditionally. It's a group that's united by religion. So an evangelical can be a WASP. It can be a Mexican immigrant. It can be a Pakistani illegal alien who's converted to evangelicalism. It can be an Irish Catholic convert to evangelicalism. It can be a Jewish convert to evangelicalism. It can be all these people, and they see themselves as members of one community on the basis of faith, but there's no common culture. And this produces something that's sociologically bizarre, wherein they present themselves as a coherent group, but there's really no cultural coherence. So it's this thing, and it's taken over quite a bit of WASP culture in the Deep South and in the Midwest. And it's very, very much this contingency in favor of typically I'll just put it this way: forms of romantic behavior that would not have been acceptable to most members of this group a generation or two before. And it's fascinating how this functions, because you just see the change coming in among these people who say, well, we've always been Christian, our culture is Christian, our heritage is Christian. But at the same time, there's no ethnic component to it, even though still to this day, the lion's share of these people are WASPs. Even to try to describe it doesn't, it's just bizarre. But it's a uniquely American thing that came about as the result of the negation of any white racial consciousness or identity on the national scale during the 1960s. So this is what you see. There's a reason why the religious right rose during the 1970s, because it was filling the void that was left in the 60s. And traditionally, American Christians view themselves, they wouldn't say our culture is Christian. They would say my culture is American if they were English, because to them, being English and American were synonymous. Or if they were Irish Catholics, they say their culture was Irish in the context of Catholicism. If they were Jewish, you were not Christians, obviously, but talking about religion, they would talk about being Jewish within the context of where their ancestors came from, Eastern Europe, North Africa, wherever. But the fact of the matter is, this is how religion and ethnicity used to go in America, where people talked about religion as a function of ethnicity. But now it's become unmoored from ethnicity, particularly among the evangelicals. And by the way, a lot of the Catholics have followed suit, where you see among Christians, religion still having a strong ethnic component would be the Eastern Orthodox movements, where it's, Georgian Orthodox, Macedonian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, so on and so forth. It's interesting talking about this. Now, the Bushes obviously are WASPs, but they don't have much of a WASP identity. I mean, you can see that with Jeb Bush and with the policies that George W. Bush advocated for. And obviously, Bush Sr. grew up in a very unambiguously WASP background. But as the country changed, he decided to minimize his WASPness to appeal to it. He actually was trying to outdo Ronald Reagan when it comes to diversity. This was during the 1980 primaries after during the presidency still at that time of Jimmy Carter. So, but after Carter's diversity measures had been done after Gerald Ford's presidency ended. So it's really something else talking about this. It's a kaleidoscope of stuff. And trying to understand it definitely can give one a headache.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I did a piece a while back where I saw stats that suggested that the evangelicals are more hardcore pro-Israel than the American Jewish population.
Yes.
By I think it was like an order of magnitude, like almost twice as hardcore or something like that.
That I can explain. It's because in their theology, Israel must be reestablished to bring about the second coming of Jesus. So they view Israel as an essential function of their theology. Now, there also is an element of cultural similarity between them and Israeli Jews. Israeli Jews are vastly more conservative than American Jews are. Actually, American Jews are more left-leaning than Jews anywhere else in the developed world. But the American evangelicals look at the Israeli Jews as being sort of kindred spirits, because if you look at video of your average Israeli city, suburb, it looks a lot like suburban Birmingham, Alabama, or Omaha, Nebraska, areas that are still very Republican. And it's because there is a cultural kinship between these peoples. They are very similar. And this is why, interestingly enough, a lot of American lefties, including many American Jews, look down on the Israeli Jews because they see this sort of right-wing society that they want nothing to do with. But this is what's going on. So there is the religious element for these evangelicals, but there's also a very strong cultural element. A lot of evangelicals would support Israel even if they lost faith in evangelicalism, because the Israelis are very similar to them, like I said. Also, because the Israelis are very interested in opposing jihadism. And among evangelicals, jihadism has a tremendously negative reputation. Of course, a deserved negative reputation. But so these are the things that go on.
Fantastic, Joseph. Well, okay, we went 2 hours. I said we go an hour, but we went 2 hours because there was so much material to cover. There are a few super chats here. Catoman55 says, "I just bought your book. What do you think? What do you think lies in store for the USA? I am hoping for anything better than hundreds of years of eugenic decline. Breaking up might be the best way forward, in my humble opinion. What do you say to that?
I think America it will not break up anytime soon. Eventually, might have a Soviet Union style implosion where it just collapses under the weight of its own ineptitude. But that would probably be at the opposite end of this century. So I think if that happens, it's a long way off. It could become like Brazil or Argentina as well. But I think America is too inherently fractious and prone to revolution for that sort of long decline of over 100 years. But I don't think if America ends, it would be due to some new civil war or anything like that. I think that it would be Uncle Sam no longer having enough money to sustain himself and just having a Soviet Union style implosion. And the people would be so fractious and of such a revolutionary mindset that they would not hold themselves together after that happens. I don't think a America breakup would be a pretty thing. I think it would be a terrible thing economically. I think it would definitely cause many needless deaths and bodily harm, terrible stuff. I think that America, if there is to be any sort of, it would be a national renaissance, but what should happen is maximum devolution to the point that there is hyper-federalism that does away with much of the federal bureaucratic state, and it allows states to be as self-governing as possible, maybe after a certain point even establishing their own immigration standards from other parts of the country with regard to other parts of the country. That would be good. There does have to be a common market between the states in order for the first world to survive in America. Although a lot of America is becoming increasingly third world anyway, so one should take that into consideration. But I think that America is in a very tight spot. I know it is. And devolution is the best way forward, maximal devolution. And this is the importance of judges being appointed who are friends of individual rights and liberties, because they are much better on states' rights and individual autonomy within the context of states' rights than progressive judges who increasingly increase the power, not increasingly increase, who progressively increase the power of the federal government, which necessarily, unfortunately, brings people into conflict with each other, because rather than deal with stuff at the local level and sorting it out there, it becomes a federal question. Then different people from different parts of the country who may speak a different language but have nothing in common with each other necessarily wind up trying to do a power grab to get their issues best represented by Uncle Sam. And that's something the founders very much did not want to see. They wanted to have a different state of affairs wherein people were able to deal with their stuff as locally as possible. Although they laid the groundwork for today's terrible turn of events by doing away with the Articles of Confederation in favor of the Constitution. Now, the Articles of Confederation were highly imperfect. They desperately needed a Bill of Rights, but the Constitution was not the answer. I would argue the Revolutionary War was not the answer, but definitely the Constitution was not the answer.
I mean, one thing I've thought about, and I don't say this as a kind of denigration or own or anything like that, but we talked about ethnogenesis earlier on. Do you see any possible future where there is an ethnogenesis in America and a kind of new type or a new race is born? I'm picturing like a kind of like a caramel color skinned kind of twerking and rapping while watching Seinfeld and The Sopranos, eating a Taco Bell, maybe, you can kind of like, you can make like a composite American that takes a little bit of every, who's fully like racially mixed. So they're kind of post-racial. Already I know I've noticed Hollywood pushes certain actors and actresses like this, where increasingly I'm like, where's this person from? She could be Latino, she could be Arabic. I can't really tell where people are from anymore. And I just wonder, like, do you see any future where, rather than breaking apart, America actually just becomes like, and you see, I've even got strange visions of Trump being the vehicle through which this happens, where it's like, if you go to the average MAGA rally now, it is kind of pretty multiracial, multicultural, yeah, I mean, what about this future, Joseph?
I think that it's definitely what a lot of people want, and not just on the left. But I think that at the end of the day, human beings tend to be most comfortable among those of their own kind. So this would never come to be this sort of, if you will, perfected multiracial blending wherein there is no longer any distinct race and everyone is the quote unquote American race, which is to say a combination of different races. That you're going to see more and more of this, no question. But I mean, I see more and more of it in my area, even though it's overwhelmingly Republican. But you expect for people more conservative, they would be less likely to. They'd be more interested in homogenous society. But at the same time, human nature is human nature. This will only ever go for a certain segment of the population. But that segment of the population will grow. But I don't think it will ever be a majority. It's not to say whites will be the majority, but I think that the majority of America will be clearly defined racial members of clearly defined racial groups. But there will be an increase in biracial and multiracial people. And it's interesting because, as I said before, America is a very, very expansive definition of whiteness. And yet, despite this, you see the blending going on between different races. But still, I think it can only go so far because people do have an inherent desire to be around those most similar to them. And that does lead people to engage in serious romantic relationships, particularly those which result in procreation. And these relationships are between people of the same race, even in some cases of the same ethnicity. But in America, race has long since supplanted ethnicity as the primary divider of different groups and their perceived interests politically, socially.
Port Film Co-op